Studios. And we have our first Independent Women's Forum guest joining us today, Hadley Heath Manning. I'll just tell you a little bit about her bio. She's the Director of Policy at IWF and the Independent Women's Voice and a Senior Blankley Fellow at the Steamboat Institute. She's testified before Congress, state legislators on various policy issues. She appears frequently on radio, on TV outlets. She's a regular guest on Fox Business. She's a favorite on Kudlow Report, and she's been featured in numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Politico, and many others. Hadley, we're so excited to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Mandy. Great to see you.
So I want to, before jumping into some of the policies you've really been focusing on lately and issues, could you just talk a little bit about what is the Independent Women's Forum and its affiliated mission?
Sure. So Independent Women's Forum is actually turning 30 years old this year. It's an excellent organization based in Washington, D.C. We have women, of course, across the country. I'm coming to you from Denver, Colorado. It is an organization that is focused on promoting policies that aren't just well-intended, but actually enhance people's freedom, choices, and opportunities. You know, particularly we focus on issues that are important to women, but our motto is all issues are women's issues. And so we've got a whole broad spectrum of issues where we take policy positions. We do research, we do advocacy, and we try to make a difference for the better.
And you do a really great job. I want to talk about one of these issues that has really percolated to the top of public discourse, and this is the baby formula shortage. You know, some are referencing it's an artificial shortage. It seems like it could have been prevented. I saw yesterday Representative Elise Stefanik was making known that she had reached out to the FDA in February, talking about her concerns with access to formula after the Abbott plant in Sturgis, Michigan was closed. You know, how did we get to this situation?
Right. Well, first of all, I'm a mom, and so this isn't just a public policy issue to me. This is a personal issue. Fortunately, my youngest child just turned 1 recently, so she's old enough to drink whole milk now. I had an issue with my first baby, actually, where she would have blood in her dirty diapers when she was nursing, and so eventually she had to switch to a very expensive, very specialized formula. So for any moms and dads out there who are struggling to find formula, you know, especially if you're looking for that specific kind of formula that your baby really needs, this is a very nerve-wracking time, and this is a real crisis for those families. So certainly not a political issue or manufactured crisis. This is a very real personal crisis for a lot of families in this country. And my heart goes out to them because I do have this experience with my first baby who really could not be breastfed. And so we recognize that many babies in this country are fed by formula. In fact, I've learned a lot as I've looked into this issue. And of course, many people are familiar with the Women, Infants, and Children program. That's a program for low-income women with babies. It provides funding for baby formula and other nutritional needs for women and young children. The WIC the WIC program in this country actually funds more than half of baby formula. So I look at this and some people say this is a market failure. You know, there was a recall by this private company. There was a failure at one of their plants. They had to pull a lot of the formula off the shelf. A lot of people say, well, this is a market failure. I say, well, let's look at some of the government policies that have been, you know, ruling over our formula market in terms of not just the way that states bid out contracts to the Women, Infants, and Children program, but also the way that our federal government intervenes with imported formula. For example, there's a lot of restrictions and tariffs on formula that comes to the United States from other countries. That's another restriction on supply. And when you have a shortage and a crisis like what we're facing right now, lawmakers need to act immediately. They should have been working on this months ago. You're right. And Representative Stefanik was right she actually has a 9-month-old baby. So I'm sure she was, you know, paying attention to this on the personal side as well. But I do not see this as a market failure. I see this as a failure of government policies.
Longstanding government policies. And it's really interesting that, especially on the import side, I was listening to yesterday that is it true recently, in more recent, as the Biden administration has been paying attention to this, they've started taking a closer look at imports. And so they're adding a layer of bureaucratic review and assessment in a time when we're dealing with a very present crisis.
Well, the Biden administration has just very recently tuned into this. This is something that Representative Stefanik and others, particularly parents, have been paying attention to for a long time. I personally have seen many parents posting, for example, on Facebook groups about, I can't find my formula. What can I do? People are sharing breast milk. People are sharing cans of formula that they might have left over that they opened, but they can't use all of it. But finally, the Biden administration tuned into this. And one of the things that the Biden administration has done is they have tried to invoke what's called the Defense Production Act, and they're directing the Department of Defense to pick up formula from overseas and literally bring it over here on military planes to the United States. But this is not something that, this was we didn't need to get to this point. We could have been doing so much more ahead of invoking the Defense Production Act. We could have been opening up the market. We could have been making it possible for women, for example, who purchase infant formula through the WIC program to choose any brand, to choose any formula provider. Many people don't realize that when a state makes a contract with the WIC program, they're making a contract that limits those women, limits those mothers to only one brand of formula in that state. That's not competitive. That's not allowing the market to work. And so there is now a piece of legislation in place that's allowing mothers to, with the WIC program, buy any type of formula that's available to them. But I see this kind of like the COVID crisis. When you're in a crisis, red tape is a big problem. But we don't need to eliminate red tape just in the midst of a crisis. We need to eliminate that red tape for good so that mothers can feed their children and so that we can have access to all that the market can provide.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And the legislation, the Access to Baby Formula Act, that was recently passed, and I believe it's headed over to the president's desk, but is essentially that measure. It will solve this issue of people who use the women, infants, and children support system. They'll have access to more than one type of formula. Is that ultimately what it will do?
Right. Well, that's in the crisis period. There is right now an exception allowing WIC purchasers to go with any brand that they choose. But there are other pieces of active legislation that would essentially make that permanent, to allow that freedom to be something that WIC participants have all the time. There's in the House, there is legislation that's sponsored by Representative Stefanik, the Babies Need More Formula Now Act. And in the Senate, there's another piece of legislation called the Formula Act, and the Formula Act is sponsored by Senator Mike Lee and several others. It would waive tariffs on infant formula from other countries. It would exempt infant formulas from certain FDA requirements, and it would give those WIC recipients permanent access to alternative formulas, even after we get through the stressful time of extreme shortage.
Well, I think you're right. Like we've got to fix the current crisis. One, we should have never been here if the administration had been paying attention to red flags coming from the industry, but also from lawmakers. It could have been prevented. But there's these long-standing policies that just make sense across the board to ensure we don't end up in this situation again. Is there a place where women who are looking for formula or they're looking for alternatives, a website or something you could direct them to if they're looking for that type of information, just to help them get through to where they have, access to a reliable source of formula?
Sure. Well, just as a very practical matter, and I've seen doctor friends slamming the president for doing exactly this, but I'm married to a pediatrician, and I would recommend the first thing you do if you're concerned about feeding your baby, talk to your pediatrician, reach out to your pediatric office. When my baby needed a specific type of formula, sometimes I could get sample cans from the pediatric office. That saved us a bunch of money. We weren't facing a national crisis at the time, but certainly talk to your doctor, because you want to get access to any resources that your doctor's office might have ahead of your baby being hospitalized. And unfortunately, there have been a couple instances of babies being hospitalized due to the formula crisis. But aside from reaching out to your pediatric office, certainly I've seen a lot of people reaching out on social media. There are organizations like Human Milk for Human Babies, where people trade breast milk, for example. But, I recognize some babies can't consume breast milk. They might have a medical issue that makes it so that they need a certain type of formula. And I'd say talk to your doctor first. I don't think it's right for the Biden administration to pass the buck to doctors. Doctors certainly didn't cause this crisis, but they're there to help.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Hadley, we're going to run out of time here pretty quickly, but I did want to touch briefly on some of the work that IWF has been doing in women's sports. Could you just briefly talk a little bit about that initiative and what we're doing to ensure that women compete against women and not undercut by men who are increasingly becoming a part of the equation because of their identity?
Sure. Well, IWF has long recognized that men and women are equally valuable. We deserve equal rights under the law, but we're not interchangeable. And that is never more clear than in maybe the most recent examples of biological males competing against women in sports. But this is bigger than sports. This applies to women being housed in single-sex prisons, women having privacy, women having every opportunity so that they don't have to compete with or have their safety violated by people who are biologically male. So we've actually introduced the Women's Bill of Rights, and I'd encourage people to come to IWF and IWV.org so they can learn about the Women's Bill of Rights that's intended to protect women's safety, privacy, and equal access to all opportunities in the face of efforts to undermine what it means to be a woman.
Thank you so much for joining us. We've got to take a quick break, but I encourage folks to take a look at IWF.org and follow Hadley. We'll be back with more after the break. All right, so we are going to now shift over. We have our final host for the show, Miss Gabriella Hoffman, I've seen has popped up on the screen. Hello and welcome.
Howdy. Good afternoon. I'm so sorry I couldn't find the link, but I'm here now. I'm excited to chat with you.
No, that's okay. We're glad you're with us. Just to let the listeners know a little bit about your background, Gabriella, or Gabby, is a freelance media consultant, columnist, podcaster, and award-winning outdoor writer. Her columns and commentary have been featured in dozens of national publications, including Washington Post, Forbes, Marie Claire, and Time magazine. She was also recently elected to the Professional Outdoor Media Association's Board of Directors. She hosts a really great podcast I encourage folks to seek out. We'll talk a little bit about it, called the District of Conservation Podcast, and has a CFACT original video series called Conservation Nation. Our paths cross because we're both visiting fellows at the Independent Women's Forum. You just heard from Hadley, and now we have Gabby to talk to us about the state of energy, conservation, and a few other issues. Gabby, again, welcome. I want to talk about first gas prices. You had a number of the administration officials, the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of the Interior on Capitol Hill yesterday. And, you know, expectedly, it was brought up the fact that Americans are now paying an average of $4.58 per gallon, an over 91% spike from when Biden took office in terms of the price per gallon of gas. I want to play one clip of Senator Josh Hawley questioning Secretary Granholm when she was on the Hill about this.
Secretary Granholm, today in the state of Missouri, the average price of gasoline today, as of this morning, is $4.10. Average price of diesel is $5.18. And I'm sure you've seen the reporting this morning that now AAA is projecting that gas prices will hit a national average of $6 a gallon by the month of August. Is this acceptable to you?
No, it is not. And you can thank the activity of Vladimir Putin for invading Ukraine and pulling essentially those barrels.
With all due respect, Madam Secretary, that's utter nonsense. In January of 2021, the average gas price in my state was $2.07. 8 months later, long before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, that price was up over 30%, and it has been going up consistently since. What are you doing to reverse this administration's policies that are drawing down our own supply of energy in this country, that are throttling oil and gas production in the United States of America? What are you doing about it?
With respect, sir, it is not administration policies that have affected supply and demand.
How can you?
Okay, so you get the point. How is it that, talk to us a little bit about what are the policies that actually are impacting, it's not Putin's price hike, it's Biden policies, but could you go a little bit into what this administration is doing that is really causing Americans to feel the pain at the pump?
There are so many policies that can explain this. And I think your listeners will recall Secretary Granholm laughing off high prices just as they were starting to spike. It was right before Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And I think you don't have to lump the two issues together. You can oppose Russian invasion. I'm very critical of Putin. I'm probably one of the most stalwart anti-Putin people because my family is from Eastern Europe, but he has nothing to do largely with the domestic policies in energy that are very, very high and resulting in a lot of high gas prices for everyone. But as you know, and we've talked about this before too, day one, they stopped all permitting for new oil and gas leases. They made everything climate centric with respect to energy policy. And in last fall, actually maybe towards the tail end of the beginning of winter, the Department of Interior issued a review of the leasing program, and they said, well, we're going to raise royalty rates in the hopes of eventually encouraging detransitioning away from oil and gas. They did the same exact thing under Obama's Interior Secretary Sally Jewell for phasing out coal leases on federal public lands, So this is part of the plan to detransition away from fossil fuels, which make our living situation a lot cheaper and also are necessary for these so-called alternatives that they are espousing and wanting us to adopt, forcibly speaking. But you have this leasing program problem explaining and bringing this problem about. I was just in Arizona and Utah filming for my Conservation Nation series. I had never seen gas prices. I saw gas prices in the $5 category for regular unleaded gas in Phoenix. Outside Scottsdale, that's unheard of. I was speaking to a friend who works in the fishing industry. She's not political. And she said to me, gas prices rose 30 cents in the last week. This is crazy. I don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. That's what she had told me, almost verbatim. And so regular people are seeing this, people who don't follow politics. They're seeing that the cost of living is rising, especially with respect to energy costs. Also, your rates that you're paying for your utility bills, those are going up too. People are not talking about that as well, but you're paying more at the pump, you're paying more in utility bills, and it seems like there's no break in sight with this. But yes, a lot of their policies, especially what they did on day one, executive actions, are explaining the price hikes we're seeing right now.
And seemingly their all-out war on domestic energy production, it reeks of some degree of tone deafness that in the face of record high gas prices, this administration canceled some offshore oil and gas leases. There were 2 scheduled in the Gulf of Mexico, 1 scheduled up in Alaska. And one of the reasons they cited was a, quote, lack of industry interest. Now, what's your take on the truth, if there is any, behind using that as a justification?
That is, simply put, what a lot of people say, fake news. There is a lot of industry interest to explore safely. The problem is there are a lot of roadblocks to them being able to pursue projects. Also, there is pressure corporate-wise and financially from banks. They're not lending to companies that want to do these projects. They're not giving them loans because of pressure from social corporate responsibility advocates. A lot of people on the far left are pressuring these financial firms to not back these projects financially. We saw it with many cases. They said, don't do it in Anwar, don't do it here. So there is an interest in the industry. You talk to smaller producers, not your Exxon and your bigger conglomerates, although some of them are starting to come around and maybe realize like appeasing these people who are not in the best interest of energy dominance or energy production here in the States, domestically speaking. I think some of them are coming around, but you talk to people who are not these big conglomerates. They say they're being hamstrung. They're not having the ability to safely extract and explore. They're not going to be able to pay fair rates because they are increasing royalty rates. The administration will give them credit. They said they're going to allow for some exploration of the leases that they've approved, but it's a minuscule amount. It's not anywhere near needed to help offset the problems they've created. Plus, they're exhausting the strategic petroleum reserve. So it's not the industry. It's more so the government.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. There's barriers to actual production, but there are also barriers in the finance sector. It's largely coming from a school of thought referred to as ESG investing, or environmental, social, and governance. Just for our listeners to explain really quick, it's a set of criteria that purportedly measures a business's commitment to environmental, social, and governance principles, and they typically take the form of environmental sustainability practices, social justice issues, and democratic and fair corporate governance. All of these really are designed to make it harder for people in traditional energy industries to not be able to get the funding and the capital credit they need to build out projects. Gabby, we have to take a really quick break, but I've got you on for one more segment. We can wrap up the conversation on ESG and then get into some of your conservation work. To our listeners out there, stay tuned. You don't want to miss the follow-up with Gabriella Hoffman, our guest from the Independent Women's Forum. Mississippi. I'm Mandy Gunasekara in the Element Wealth Studios, and I am still joined by Gabriella Hoffman, who is a visiting fellow at the Independent Women's Forum. We were just wrapping up the last conversation talking about really a damaging approach to investing designed to push investors away from our traditional energy industries and services, but it's also found its way, some criticism from an unlikely person. Gabby, you just wrote an article about the fact that Elon Musk, I was talking about earlier, but Elon Musk, the creator and establisher of Tesla, has become increasingly critical of ESG as well. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So I think, like anything in life, when you are personally afflicted or, let's say, scorned by people who are supposed to be your allies, you start to shift. And that is the case with Elon Musk, obviously Tesla's CEO. And he's kind of gone on a very interesting journey politically and also culturally too. He obviously, with his acquiring of Twitter, soon to be acquisition of Twitter, it has probably awakened him to a lot of things. And I think he's started to observe things for a while. But his qualms with ESG is that the S&P 500 Global took Tesla off the list for the ESG index, citing that they're not reducing carbon emissions enough and they have some questionable business practices. So he was pointing out, and obviously his company posted a 2021 impact report saying, well, actually, the ESG findings don't account for actual positive contributions. It's more like virtue signaling on the financial front. And so he has said, well, this is really just a scam. That's how he labeled it verbatim. And he said that it doesn't measure environmental impact or environmental contributions on the business side. So I think more and more people in his position, high profile folks in the financial sector, are going to start calling out ESG for what it is. And he's actually not the first person. Interestingly enough, one of the biggest companies or former representatives of BlackRock, as I noted in my piece, Tariq Friday, he had actually talked about how it actually is just mere virtue signaling as well. So he had said, like, green bonds really don't equate to anything. And there's a lot of subjective studies about how long and far reaching these kind of investments go and that they're actually really not that impactful. And also the Harvard Business Review had concluded that the impacts from these financial investments are actually very minuscule. So they're not as impactful financially and economically as they are touted to be. So Elon Musk certainly sounded the alarm on ESG. So I think more will follow because people like to look to him for inspiration, for guidance, and a lot of people I think will start to follow cues from him. So very encouraging to see that actually. So someone as prominent as him.
Yeah, well, and it's easy to say he's a market-moving figure. That's what is happening in the private sector. Just to let listeners know, too, there's efforts by this administration to integrate ESG standards over the Securities and Exchange Commission. Gabriella and I have been writing a couple pieces to highlight this, but we'll be talking about this more for sure. Now, let's shift a little bit about your conservation work. Could you talk a little bit about your work affiliated with the 30 by 30 policies and recent pushback and responses you've been getting from folks as you've traveled around the country to talk to people impacted by it?
Yeah, so my work out west recently was not specifically about 30 by 30, but I did travel to the Stop 30 by 30 summit and I spoke at it in Lincoln, Nebraska, where there are about 200 activists, very serious people. These are not conspiracy theorists. These are very well researched, respectable individuals from their respective states. You have county commissioners, you have activists, you have politicians, a lot of people who are very plugged into the private or the public land space. They're very much involved. They are stakeholders who like to have their opinion considered, and they feel very left out in conversations about 3030. But more specifically, many people are very concerned that a tool that is being used by the administration, specifically national monument enlargements under the Antiquities Act, can be used as part of 3030 plan. So that was what largely brought me out west, and I talked about that a little bit with my video, and just extolling how you have to keep public lands designations as is and not exceed, let's say, presidential or even governmental authority on that, because that could actually keep people off public lands. But 3030 more specifically, you start to see a lot of momentum building up against it because there are many questions about the scope and scale of the reach of the program. As I've noted at IWF quite often, we have highlighted the alternatives to 30 by 30. We've also kind of broken down the numbers. Is the administration being truthful? And I've argued that they are not. They're undercounting how many percentage of lands, public lands, especially out west, are already protected and sectioned off for no multiple uses. About 40% or so, not 30%, is already conserved. And you talk to different states and people from states out west. With Utah, for example, nearly 2/3 of lands there are held by the feds, and about a little bit less in Utah, about maybe a third to about 40% are held by the feds as well. So, and Nevada is almost 100% federally controlled as well. I didn't go to Nevada, but if you go more out west, same with Alaska, you'll start to notice that. So a lot of states out west have great concerns about 30/30 scope. It also doesn't define conservation clearly, and that is why there are letters from Senators Kramer and other Republican lawmakers, even the likes of Mitt Romney, who is actually pretty attuned to these public lands issues, much like Mike Lee in Utah. So you have a lot of senators raising alarms, and they are wanting a NEPA review. They sent a letter to the White House CEQ office asking for a review because of the grand scale of 30 by 30, this initiative, and what would it take to be implemented. So they've demanded that they have a response by mid-June. I'm not sure if they're going to get a response because it seems like this administration doesn't want to give a response. They're very determined to implement this without feedback, although they're saying we're welcoming local stakeholder opinion. We want to have hunters and anglers chime in on this issue. We really welcome private property rights. I think it's just a mirror of trying to assuage concerns. And I've talked to people in Utah and Arizona who said it sounds great and they're trying to placate perhaps whatever their agenda is and say that, yes, we're having a good faith effort and trying to bring in all these stakeholders. But you talk to people behind the scenes, they say that one commissioner that I spoke to said that Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland said, okay, we'll hear you out. But she already had a predetermined response about monument enlargements and even 30/30. So they say a great thing in public, but behind the scenes, they're pretty adamant and pretty clear about their intentions. And many stakeholders out west feel very, very kind of sidelined and worried that they're going to implement this without any stakeholder feedback and input and just cause a lot of confusion and really distort what conservation means. A lot of people see 30 by 30 as a preservationist plan. And if people ask, in the sporting community, a lot of sportsmen are very hesitant to take a position because they want to have a seat at the table, thinking if they're neutral and they say, okay, we could be open to this, that they'll be received well. But I'm not so optimistic like some of my friends in the bigger sporting community writ large. And I worry that they're negotiating away hunting access and hunting rights, probably a topic we'll go into about the prospective ban on lead bullets and tackle on public lands. That's a lawsuit that is potentially pending from the Fish and Wildlife Service, potentially with settling with Center for Biological Diversity. And so sportsmen and women are trying to take a neutral approach, but because they are starting to negotiate away public access for hunters and anglers, I think they may start to come around on this. But that's kind of a long-winded overview of it, but you do start to see more congressional response starting to take fold, especially because this is such a grand scale project and initiative.
That's right. And just so our listeners know, 30 by 30, we reference it all the time, but it's to conserve at least 30% of U.S. land and ocean by 2030, which is a part of an international push this administration is trying to adopt domestically for purposes of advancing their climate change agenda. And Gabby's been really great going around talking to folks. And one of the things you mentioned this, their mentality to protecting the environment is to prohibit or preserve versus use in a responsible manner. You've written extensively about it. And at the heart of one of those issues is forest health. So could you talk a little bit about policies this administration has pushed that really lend itself to unhealthy forests that really is a response to their prohibitive style policies that are preventing private property owners and others from being able to go in and maintain healthy forests, which will be increasingly important as we go into the summer season where there will no doubt be wildfires around the country?
Absolutely. And on my way to Phoenix, Arizona, I actually caught a sight of the New Mexico fire that is currently raging just east of Albuquerque. And it was horrific to see that even from the plane. It was quite obvious, even from 30,000 feet above, just the impact of those high intensity wildfires. But with respect to the administration, President Biden signed an executive order on Earth Day pledging his support to address wildfires. And again, he attached it to climate change, not separating the issue because it is a tertiary. The impact of climate is very kind of minuscule compared to the grand scheme of things. Live fuels are the biggest impact. Weather patterns are the second. most important contributing factor to high intensity fires, and climate comes at third. So the fact that they continue to lump forest management with climate change really defeats the essence of the need to manage forests. But also in his executive order, he talked about pumping in millions and billions of dollars to forest enhancement. It wasn't very specific. I also talked about this at IWF as well. They don't really talk about prescribed burn regimens, mechanical thinning. And then he said that they want to stretch this out across 10 years. There's no time. You have to do this within 5 years, even quicker, because there is such a magnificent backlog. There's, I think, 80 million acres of forest that require immediate treatment, and they keep continuing to kick
All right, Gabby,
down the road.
We're going to run out of time really quick, but just for our listeners, you can hear more from her District of Conservation podcast. Gabby, thank you for joining us. She has a lot to say on these issues. We'll have more after the break.